July 1881, Fort Sumner, New Mexico. Officially, this is the night Billy the Kid is finally taken off the board. Shot by Sheriff Pat Garrett inside the Maxwell house. Simple ending, right? Except when you line up the details, the timeline starts to wobble. Who was actually in the room? And where were the deputies? How did anyone recognize anyone in a dark house in the middle of the night? Was Billy armed? And did Garrett try to arrest him, or just fire? The weird part is that the story that became the official version depends on a few seconds almost nobody could see clearly, and the paper trail is thinner than you'd expect for the most famous outlaw in the Old West. Let's walk through the night step by step and see what doesn't add up. Number 1, Fort Sumner in July 1881. Fort Sumner, New Mexico Territory, was not a big Wild West boomtown. It was a small, spread-out place where the Maxwell Ranch was the center of gravity, and most people knew each other's business. That matters because it's the kind of setting where an outlaw can hide in plain sight, especially if he has friends, favors owed, or family connections nearby. Billy the Kid did. He'd spent time around the area before, and he wasn't just a name on a wanted poster there. Locals knew him as the Kid, or Bonnie, and some saw him as a reckless young cowboy, sometimes friendly, sometimes dangerous, depending on the moment. Outsiders saw outlaw. Insiders often saw somebody's kid, a person they could talk to, trade with, or warn. The place itself also carried heavy history. Fort Sumner sat near Bosque Redondo, where the U.S. government had forced thousands of Navajo and Mescalero Apache people to live in the 1860s. Even though that chapter was earlier, it shaped how locals felt about authority and about armed men showing up to enforce someone else's rules. In that atmosphere, lawmen didn't automatically get cooperation, even if their badges were legal. By the summer of 1881, Billy's legend was already running ahead of the facts. He used multiple names: Henry McCarty, Henry Antrim, William H. Bonney. And in the Old West, people cared more about reputation than paperwork. What everyone could agree on was this: he had been tied to the Lincoln County war mess. He had embarrassed powerful men, and he had escaped when he wasn't supposed to. That turned him from a dangerous outlaw into a personal problem for lawmen who wanted to look in control. Pat Garrett, the sheriff of Lincoln County, was the one expected to solve that problem. In a simple story, it's lawman versus outlaw, and the law wins. In the real territory, it's politics, pressure, and image. Garrett had already captured Billy once. After Billy escaped again, Garrett didn't just need to catch him. He needed to finish it in a way the public would accept. That's why the details of one night at the Maxwell place keep getting picked apart. When the official version depends on a few seconds in the dark, every choice before and after those seconds starts to look important. Number 2, the road to Fort Sumner. To understand why the Fort Sumner timeline is controversial, it helps to see how tightly the months before it fit together. Late 1880, Garrett and his posse capture Billy at Stinking Springs. Billy is moved through the territorial justice system, and by spring 1881, he's convicted and sentenced to hang. For Garrett, that should have been the end of the chase. The law had him. But Billy's story at that point already had one more twist built into it: the earlier promise of a pardon. Before Garrett became sheriff, Governor Lew Wallace had been involved in trying to stabilize Lincoln County, and Billy had talked about testifying in exchange for protection. Whether you call it a deal, a misunderstanding, or politics changing direction, the practical result was that Billy believed he might be pardoned, and then he wasn't. That matters because it changed how he looked at surrender or working with the law. If you think the system broke its word, you stop trusting the system. Then comes the April 1881 escape in Lincoln. 2 guards die during the breakout, and suddenly it's not just he's wanted. Now it's the sheriff couldn't keep him locked up. In a place where authority is fragile, that kind of embarrassment sticks. It also changes how a lawman thinks. An arrest is risky if you've already seen the prisoner slip the system once. That doesn't automatically mean a lawman will shoot, but it creates the mindset where don't let him get away again, starts sounding like policy. After the escape, sightings and rumors pile up. Some are real, some are exaggerations, and some are probably people repeating what they read. But Fort Sumner keeps showing up in the chatter, and it makes sense. It's a place where Billy could get food, swap horses, pick up information, and blend into a community that didn't automatically side with outside lawmen. It also sits near routes that spread out toward Texas and deeper into New Mexico. For a young outlaw, it's not a dead end. It's a reset point with options. By mid-July 1881, Garrett heads toward Fort Sumner with 2 deputies, John Poe and Thomas Kip McKinney. On paper, that's the sensible move. More lawmen means more control, more witnesses, and less chance of a surprise. The problem is that, in this case, having more lawmen didn't produce one clear story. It produced several, and those differences sit right on top of the critical minutes. Number 3, waiting for an outlaw in the dark. Most accounts agree on the basic setup. Garrett reaches the Maxwell place, gets information that Billy is in the area or could show up, and decides to wait. Pete Maxwell isn't just a random homeowner. He's connected, he's respected locally, and he's exactly the kind of person an outlaw might trust enough to visit. That makes the Maxwell house the perfect intersection point between Billy's world and Garrett's world. Garrett and Billy also weren't total strangers in the way people imagine. They had moved in overlapping circles in the territory before, which makes the later, "how did he recognize him?" question both easier and more complicated. This is where the timeline starts feeling slippery. How certain was Garrett that Billy would come to Maxwell's that night? If he had solid information, what happened looks like an ambush, even if he intended a legal arrest. If he didn't have solid information, then the story leans on coincidence and luck. Garrett's own explanations usually land in the middle. Smart tracking plus a lucky moment. Skeptics point out that the lucky moment is doing a lot of work for a man who needed a clear result. There's also the obvious question, why at night? A nighttime arrest is dangerous for everyone. You can't see hands. You can't control who is in a room. You can't be sure you're looking at the right person. But night also has a practical advantage for a lawman under pressure. Fewer people can describe what they saw because they didn't see it clearly. If things end in gunfire, the narrative gets easier to steer because the scene is literally hard to see. Accounts differ on where Poe and McKinney were while Garrett waited. In some versions, they're right there near the doorway. In others, they're in a yard, near the horses, or outside the house. Those aren't tiny differences. In a dark house shooting, distance is the difference between "I saw the person in his hands" and "I heard a voice and a gunshot." It also affects whether this was a controlled arrest attempt or a one-man confrontation with backup somewhere in the background. Even the clock is fuzzy. And when later writers round the moment to a neat midnight, it can hide a real gap of an hour or more. Many tellings put the moment near midnight, others push it later. In 1881, people weren't syncing watches, but when the time is vague, it becomes easier for stories to drift into whatever feels most believable. The less precise the timeline, the more room there is for the legend to move around inside it. Number 4, the exchange everyone argues about. Here's the version most people have heard, stripped down to the basic steps. Garrett is inside Pete Maxwell's room, waiting in the dark. Billy comes into the house late at night. He senses something off and asks, in Spanish, "¿Quién es?" Meaning, who is it? Garrett shoots, and that's the end. The trouble is that almost every key detail inside those minutes has competing versions, and each version changes what the timeline means. Start with recognition. Some stories say Billy recognized Garrett's voice. Others suggest he saw a shape and realized it wasn't Maxwell alone. At the same time, Garrett's explanation needs him to recognize Billy fast enough to justify firing instead of trying to arrest him. In a truly dark room, recognition is not automatic. A voice can help, but voices can be misread under stress. A silhouette can help, but only if there's enough light to outline it. That doesn't make the story impossible, but it does make it easy for people to argue that Garrett's certainty was assumption, not identification. Then there's the "Quién es" line itself. It shows up so often that it almost feels like a fixed movie quote. It might be accurate, but it also might be a phrase that got repeated because it's short, dramatic, and fits the bilingual reality of the area. Over time, retellings can lock onto one clean line even if the real exchange was messier. Some accounts add a follow-up like, "Who is it?" repeated, or Billy calling out a name. Each tweak changes the timing by seconds, and seconds are the whole game. The weapon question is another pressure point. Some accounts claim Billy had a pistol in his hand. Others say he had a knife, possibly because he'd been cutting meat or planning to cut meat. Others suggest he wasn't actively armed in that instant, or that his gun was on his belt. This isn't trivia. Some versions even disagree on whether Garrett fired one shot or two in quick succession. If Billy clearly raised a gun, the shooting reads like straightforward self-defense. If Billy had a knife, it suggests surprise and confusion more than an immediate gunfight. If Billy wasn't clearly armed, the moral and legal framing becomes much harder for Garrett, especially with deputies nearby. Location shifts too. Was Billy in the doorway, just inside the room, in a hall, or near the kitchen? Those differences matter because they change who could see him, how close Garrett was, and whether there was time to issue a challenge. In a house, even a few steps can be the difference between "he was right on me" and "he was across the room." And here's the practical puzzle that keeps coming back. If 3 lawmen are on site, with surprise on their side, and the suspect walks into a familiar home where he doesn't expect a full arrest team, why does it end in a split-second shooting instead of an attempted arrest? If the answer is, it happened too fast, then the timeline becomes everything. If the answer is, Garrett chose to shoot, then motive becomes everything. Either way, the official story lives on a handful of seconds that almost nobody could see clearly. Number 5, the immediate aftermath and the thin record. After the shot, the basic story is that the body is identified as Billy the Kid and buried quickly in the local cemetery at Fort Sumner. He was said to be buried near 2 of his companions, Tom O'Folliard and Charlie Bowdre, men killed earlier in the same pursuit, which helped turn that cemetery into a kind of anchor point for the entire Billy myth. A quick burial in July heat isn't strange. What's strange is how little hard, surviving documentation exists for an event that became one of the most famous moments in Old West history. There was no widely accepted official photograph of the body. There's no modern-style forensic record, obviously, but even by 1881 standards, the descriptions that come down to us are not as detailed as you'd expect for a high-profile outlaw killed by a sheriff. That leaves identification heavily dependent on recognition by people who were already expecting Billy, and who had strong reasons, political, practical, personal, to accept that it was him. The witness problem continues right here. Pete Maxwell is central, but his role is awkward. If Billy came to Maxwell's room, Maxwell is either an unlucky bystander or part of the setup. Different retellings lean different ways, and that affects how you read every later detail. Poe and McKinney are supposed to provide supporting testimony, but their exact positions aren't consistently described over time. Hearing the exchange is not the same as seeing the moment, and if their distance from the door changes from one telling to another, their value as anchors for the timeline changes too. News reporting adds more distortion. Territorial newspapers often worked from short telegraphed summaries and secondhand statements. They also loved clean narratives. Famous outlaw, famous lawman, dramatic moment, story over. Once a simple version hits print, it hardens. People repeat it. Later tellers adjust their memory to match the official story, even if their original recollection had more uncertainty. That's one reason frontier timelines can look sharper on paper than they were in real life. Then there's the later problem of the grave itself. Billy was buried at Fort Sumner, but the cemetery area has dealt with weather, time, and changes to the site. Stories about flooding and shifting ground come up in discussions because they make later identification work harder. If you can't be perfectly sure where the remains are, modern testing becomes complicated fast. That doesn't prove anything about 1881, but it shows how early gaps can turn into permanent uncertainty. and the legal aftermath often feels tidier in summaries than it did at the time. Garrett was the sheriff. He wasn't supposed to be treated like a random shooter. If everything was clearly justified and universally accepted, you'd expect a clean official trail that's easy to point to. Historically, what comes through instead is a mix: acceptance from some, suspicion from others, and a sense that the territory wanted the Billy problem closed more than it wanted a full public dissection of how it was closed. Number 6, how motives bend a timeline. When people say, the stories don't match, they sometimes jump straight to conspiracy. It's more complicated. Stress distorts memory. People fill in gaps. People copy each other without noticing. But motive matters too, and in the Old West, motive is everywhere. Garrett had strong incentives to frame the shooting as unavoidable. After the Lincoln escape, he couldn't afford another public failure. And he couldn't afford to look like someone who shot first without reason. So the details that keep showing up, darkness, sudden movement, the suspect being armed, the impossibility of arrest, aren't just random details. They're the building blocks of justification. Garrett also moved quickly to lock in a narrative. His early public account, and later his book, helped cement a particular version, while memories were still fresh, but also while he had the strongest platform. That doesn't prove he lied, but it does show how quickly a first official story can shape what everyone treats as fact. Local politics mattered too. Billy wasn't only a criminal, he was tied to a factional conflict. Some people wanted him dead to avoid testimony and to keep old grudges from being reopened. Some wanted him alive to clear names or settle scores. Some simply wanted the territory to calm down. In that environment, people don't always say everything they know, especially if speaking up could put them in danger or drag them into a fight they're trying to avoid. Fort Sumner itself had a community with its own priorities and a long memory of outside authority. If the safest move is to keep your head down, you keep quiet. Quiet creates rumor space, and once rumors start, it wasn't really him. He got away. Someone else was buried. Every missing document becomes fuel. A gap that might be normal for 1881 becomes suspicious because the legend is so big. That's the cycle. The more famous Billy becomes, the more people expect modern-level certainty, and the more the thin 1881 record looks like a cover-up, even when it might just be the normal messiness of frontier law enforcement. Number 7. Mistaken identity and the survival industry. The strongest reason survival claims won't die is simple. The identity chain from 1881 isn't airtight. Fort Sumner wasn't a place with formal records and clean official ID checks. People used nicknames. Plenty of young men around ranch country could fit a general description. Lean build, weathered face, quick movement, armed sometimes, speaking both English and Spanish. If you want to imagine a mistaken identity, the setting gives you enough room to do it. Now look at incentives. Garrett benefits if the dead man is accepted as Billy. The territory benefits because the hanging sentence is effectively carried out without the logistical risk of moving a prisoner and possibly losing him again. People who feared Billy feel safer. People who might have helped him stay quiet. Even if nobody planned a mistake could be locked in fast because nobody powerful had a reason to reopen the question. Decades later, claimants step into that gap. The best known is Brushy Bill Roberts, who in the mid-20th century claimed he was Billy the Kid and tried to get a pardon from New Mexico authorities. Supporters pointed to personal stories, scars, and familiarity with people and places. Critics pointed to age problems, contradictions, and the way a person can absorb details from books and newspapers and later repeat them as if they're memories. Another name often mentioned is John Miller, an older man in Arizona who some locals believed was Billy. After his death, the claim grew because he couldn't contradict it, and because he lived quietly under a new name is exactly the kind of story that spreads. Modern ideas like DNA testing sound like a clean fix, but in practice they're messy. You need confirmed relatives or confirmed samples, and you need graves that can be tested without destroying what little evidence exists. Legal permission, family objections, and local politics can stop or delay tests, which keeps the debate open. The longer the debate stays open, the more space there is for the legend to grow, and for new proof to appear that's really just a fresh retelling of old rumors. The important point is not that survival claims are automatically true, it's that they feed on uncertainty. If the Fort Sumner night were documented like a modern law enforcement shooting, with clear reports, consistent witness statements, and hard identification, the survival story would fade. Instead, the original timeline is flexible enough for people to keep pushing new versions into it. Number 8. The facts that hold and the facts that drift. A few things are firm. Billy the Kid was real, and he was deeply tied to the Lincoln County War era. He escaped custody in April 1881 and returned to outlaw life. Pat Garrett was actively hunting him and had already proven he could catch him. Fort Sumner was a logical place for Billy to show up because of his local connections. And in July 1881, at Pete Maxwell's place, Garrett shot a man who was then buried locally as Billy the Kid. What drifts are the mechanics? The lead-up, the exact positions, the split-second decisions, and the certainty of identification in the moment. If Garrett expected Billy to appear at Maxwell's, it reads like a deliberate trap. If he didn't, it reads like coincidence that's hard to measure. If Billy was clearly armed and moving to fire, the decision to shoot is easier to defend. If he wasn't clearly armed, the choice to shoot instead of arrest, especially with deputies present, looks harder to justify. The drift continues into the first hours after. Who examined the body closely? Who announced the death, and how quickly? What did locals say before the newspaper version hardened into the story? In frontier history, those first 24 hours are where the truth either gets locked down or starts sliding. In this case, the key minutes happened in the dark. The documentation is thinner than people expect, and later accounts shift depending on who is speaking and what they need the story to do. That's why the Fort Sumner night stays controversial, even without a single proven alternative theory. The event sits right where outlaw legend meets lawman reputation, and the timeline is uncertain enough that people keep rechecking the same basics. Who knew what beforehand? Who stood where? What was said? And how certain the identification really was?